So now I'm going to introduce you to somebody who is very, very well known in sociology, and that is C. Wright Mills. He was American. He taught at Columbia University, and in 1959 he wrote a book called The Sociological Imagination. I'm going to talk about this idea of a sociological imagination and restate what it is in several ways to make sure that you really understand it. This tends to be, in my experience, one of the concepts that students have a difficult time grasping just reading about it. So I'm going to talk about it a bit. And I want to point out here that rather than talk in the third person like the textbook does, I'm going to refer to you and I in more personal terms. Basically, what the sociological imagination means is that you can't view yourself as this isolated person, completely unaffected by what's come before you in society, and completely unaffected by what's going on around you in society right now. Instead, we have all these different social forces in society that are going on now, and they've always gone on. So you're affected by what's come before you, the history of society, in a larger sense, as well as in a smaller personal sense, like, your family history. You're affected by what's come before you at the same time as you're affected by all these social forces in society right now. So there's you in the middle. You've got the history of what's gone on before you, and you've got the history of what's going on right now. Here's you. So when I talk about social forces, what do I mean? Race, gender, religion, politics, social class. There's probably a group of other ones that I just couldn't fit on the slide. And you're affected by everything that these have involved, historically speaking. So as a woman, when I talk about this, one of the things that I immediately think of, also because I write about feminism a bit for my classes, is feminism. So as a woman, I'm affected by the social forces of gender and race and the physical environment and politics in terms of the suffrage movement, women gaining the right to vote, in terms of women gaining the right to be educated, not just educated, but an education equal to that of men. I'm affected by when birth control, safe, effective, reliable birth control that was affordable, widely became available in the 60s. That affects me now. I'm affected by the fact that in 1969, abortion became legal in all of Canada. And you didn't have to go before a therapeutic abortion committee in order to be approved for one. I'm affected by fights for fair wages and fair pay and all of that. All those social forces that were acting in society before I was born in 1971 affect me now. Just like all those social forces that are currently going on affect me now. So every person is not an isolated individual doing their own thing. All of these things are shaping and affecting and altering and regulating and determining your life. You may not be completely full aware of them. You may not feel like you're aware of them at all, but they're there and they are having an effect. So I'm going to give you kind of a hokey analogy, but it might help you because it pops into my head. I want you to picture a plant, and it's in the garden outside and has all these roots, different roots going down into the soil, and then you have the plant that's up above the soil. And every one of these roots is a social force. So one root is for race and one is for gender, and all the examples I've just given you. Those are all the social forces that have come before us that are affecting us now. But then you've got the soil, and above ground is what's going on right now. And those social forces are above ground as well, and they're also affecting us right now. In the textbook, at the bottom of page 4, there's a very, very good example to demonstrate this, how social forces affect us on a personal level and a societal level. Now, first of all, the quote here, the awareness of the relationship between personal experience and the wider society, that is the official part of the official definition in a textbook. of sociological imagination. So it gives you this example of unemployment. Clearly, unemployment is a personal issue, but it's also a social issue. It's a social force, and we often hear about unemployment rates going up and down for the country as a whole or in different areas of the country. Unwed single moms are another example. This is a personal issue, but it's affected by wider societal issues, and societal issues affect it. If you are a victim of crime, that is another example. Clearly a personal issue, but rates of crime in different areas of the country or different kinds of crime. This is also a societal issue. So this is the sociological imagination. Now, so far, what have we talked about? I talked to you about exactly what sociology is and taking a sociological perspective. We talked about this idea of social institutions or social structures and how they actually regulate society, whether you realize it or not. They regulate society as a whole and how people interact. And I talked to you about this idea of the sociological imagination. Next, we're going to proceed with somebody who I quite enjoy discussing, and that is Emile Durkheim. So now we're really going to get into sociological theory. Don't let that freak you out or become daunting, because I enjoy talking about theory, and one of the reasons I enjoy talking about it is because when I simplify it and students realize that it can be simple and easy to understand, then they have an easier time talking about it as well. So the picture you're looking at is Emile Durkheim. He was French, he was a sociologist, and he's actually regarded as one of the founders of sociology as a discipline. It would be impossible to take an intro soc course without discussing Durkheim, or a classical theory course. You'll encounter his name in a whole variety of courses because he was such a prolific writer. Even though he wrote so much, we're going to focus on a tiny, tiny, tiny little amount of his work that's still very important. Because Durkheim wrote about what he called social facts. He said, social facts are the social relations in which we are all embedded. And I'm going to explain this clearly because it sounds kind of odd when you read it the first time. What he did, Durkheim used suicide as an example to demonstrate this. And at the time that Durkheim lived, it was kind of widely believed in society that if a person committed suicide, they did it because of a personal psychological disorder. So to use more modern terminology, more current terminology, at the time it was believed that only somebody who was mentally ill would consider or even commit suicide. And Durkheim completely disagreed with this. Instead, Durkheim said that rates of suicide would vary in a society based on social solidarity. In other words, based on how connected to society a person felt. So, he said social solidarity is the degree to which a person is connected to the society around them, the degree to which they feel they are really part of society. Makes sense. So, if you have the same general values and beliefs as the people around you, if you have a lot of social interaction in your life, and that social interaction is quality interaction, if you generally have a sense of belonging, you have a high degree of social solidarity. If you don't, if you feel like you just generally don't belong with anybody, if you feel like you really don't have any connections with anybody, if you feel like you just don't see the world the same way other people do, if you have a lower level of social solidarity, then you're much more likely to think of committing suicide because you don't feel as connected to society. So, to me, this just seems to be common sense in a way. I don't know if that's just me or what, but this is what Durkheim said, and he referred to this as a social fact. So that means that Durkheim could conclude that groups with a high degree of social solidarity has lower rates of suicide. Now, the textbook also refers to being married versus being single as an example of this. The fact that married people are less likely to commit suicide than people who are not married, because marriage kind of binds people to their society more. They feel more connected. Now, this doesn't mean if somebody is married, they won't consider suicide or won't do it, but it's much less likely, even if the marriage is not entirely a happy one. So that's another example of demonstrating a social fact. And when we look at Durkheim, he was a functionalist. Durkheim leads us to our first main sociological theory. We have functionalism, conflict theory, symbolic interactionism, and feminism. Functionalism, or structural functionalism, is our first one. I'm not quite sure why the textbook discusses Durkheim before it gets to functionalism. If I was the editor, I would have included him after this title, but it is what it is. So Durkheim is a functionalist, and functionalism is our first theory. It is a macro perspective, which means that it really steps back and looks at society as a whole. And functionalism is very, very straightforward. It says that human behavior is governed by social structures, that's what I've just said, that are based mainly on shared values that contribute to social stability. I refer to functionalism as a very optimistic, happy theory because, in a simplistic way, it views society as everybody does what they're supposed to do and society is fine. It's functional. That's where the term for that, that's where the name for the theory comes from. Generally, functionalism believes certain key things, and while each of these is a different point, they all overlap with each other considerably. So first, as I've just explained, yes, we have these social structures, these social institutions in society. Every theory sees them, but every theory has a different opinion as to what their function is. According to functionalism, they believe that these social structures, these social institutions, govern patterns of social relations, which just means they govern how we all interact within society. So picture yourself as you are right now, wherever you are, and put yourself in that little empty white space in the middle of all these social structures. Happy little student. And as you're this happy little student getting everything done, society keeps doing what it's supposed to do. All of these social things are happening around us. And what these do is in part determine how we should all interact, how we should all act with each other. Functionalism sees these social structures serving a functional purpose as keeping society going. That's the first key point with functionalism. And all this necessarily involves social stability. The second key point for functionalism, again, something I've already mentioned, is that society is all about maintaining social stability. All of these social structures are operating around you. They're doing what they're supposed to do. And as a result of this, society is stable. It's strong. And according to functionalism, that's the way a society should be. This is the natural state of society. So picture a house that's being built and the foundation under their house. The house foundation has concrete and rebar, all this really strong material to provide a good, stable foundation for the house. According to functionalism, in a way, this is what these social structures do. They provide social stability for society. And you know, not to be hokey, but I mean, we are lucky that we live in Canada that has a very high degree of stability in society compared to other countries in the world. So functionalism says if society is not stable, that's very negative. And part of this depends on the third point, which is that everybody in society has very similar values and beliefs. They don't have to be exactly the same. This all ties back into being stable, because in order for a society to be stable, everybody has to be relatively similar. If we weren't, stability wouldn't be possible. And one of the backbones of maintaining a stable society is having shared values. And this, again, to me, just kind of makes sense if you think about it. So they have to be similar, not the same. So, for example, some people feel premarital sex is okay, some don't. Some go to a church or a mosque or another religious building on a regular basis and are very religious. So we have different religions, but at the same time, some people are not religious at all. But we do have generally agreed upon basic values. No marriage or intimate relationships between close relatives. A minimum age at which people should be allowed to be married. That you can only be married to one person at a time. We have similar values and beliefs regarding basic rights for all people. So this is part of what functionalism says is necessary in society. And the fourth key point with functionalism is that the natural state of society is to be calm. Not just to be stable, but to be calm. Maintaining an equilibrium is very, very important. So functionalism, for example, would look at a civil war in a country between two different groups, like maybe the Hutu and Tutsis in Rwanda. And according to functionalism, this needs to be corrected as quickly as possible because the natural state of society is equilibrium. This doesn't mean change can't occur in a society, but any change that does occur should be slow and measured, not sudden. So if you picture water like this, yeah, change can occur, but it shouldn't be sudden. So if you're around docks or a marina where there's boats, they'll have signs up that say raise no wake. And what that means is when you're taking your boat out or bringing your boat in, don't go too fast because you'll raise small waves. You'll raise a wake and it disturbs people. It's kind of the way that functionalism views change. You can have change, but raise no wake. Don't make it too sudden. This is why, overall, then, I refer to functionalism as an optimistic, happy theory. It views everything in society having a purpose and doing what it's supposed to do and working well together. It views people being very similar, and it kind of assumes that there's an agreement or a consensus with everything in society. And it views society as being stable, which is why I view functionalism as kind of a optimistic, happy theory. And this might be a simplistic way of looking at it and explaining the theory, but it's also an effective way to remember it. And what functionalism believes is in its own name. Functionalism believes that society is functional, that the way it is works well. Now, there's two other functional theorists mentioned in the textbook, Talcott Parsons and Robert Mearns, so make sure you read about them as well. And that's functionalism in a nutshell. The next theory is conflict theory. This is also a macro perspective. This is a theory that kind of steps back and really looks at society as a whole. And I think whether you've studied social in the past or not, there's a pretty good chance that you've heard of Karl Marx. On the left is when he's younger, on the right when he's older. His work is studied in a whole variety of disciplines and in a whole variety of manners. In journalism courses, his theories are studied in economics, history courses, politics, philosophy, religion. All his theories collectively are known as Marxism or conflict theory. And those two terms are used interchangeably. They generally mean the same thing. So don't let this confuse you. Marx was German, and he was born in 1818. And because of this, as an adult, he saw the effects of the Industrial Revolution, and this is where all his ideas came from. So that's why I've included the date he was born, because when he lived is extremely important to what he wrote about. So he focused on the results of the Industrial Revolution. I think most people are familiar with it, but if you're not, the Industrial Revolution refers to all the enormous shift that occurred when societies as a whole went into mechanized means of production. when societies went from everything being done by hand, for the most part, to the emergence of machines and quick methods of production. So, a really, really rapid economic transformation in England and Europe and eventually North America because of the introduction of these industrial processes. In other words, society as a whole went from being based on much, much smaller scale methods of making money, like farming and small family businesses, to much, much larger scale methods of making money, like factories. Society as a whole went from hand production methods to machines, machine tools, and this is when factories first emerged. Now, to us in our day and time, and I include myself in this doesn't seem like something significant, but it was. It was hugely, massively significant. And the only way I can think of to try to demonstrate to you what a hugely significant effect this must have had on every part of society is to try to imagine our current society, our current life, doing the opposite. If we tried to imagine what our society would be like with no machinery, no automated processes of any kind, no cars, no appliances, no large-scale methods of producing food. If you went back to living on small farms with no technology of any kind, no electricity, no machinery, just think of how that would affect every single part of your life and what you do during the day. How you washed your clothes without washing machines, how you cooked food, where you got the food from, where you worked. So no matter where it is specifically that you live, how would it affect your daily life, your community? It would affect how people traveled, when they traveled, without vehicles or even anything to maintain the roads. How would it affect communication? How often you communicate with people without phones or computers of any kind. So if we imagine going back to unmechanized society and how that would affect our life on every single level, as an individual, as a family, as a community, as a country, we can kind of impose what it must have been like for people going through the Industrial Revolution. This is the size of the effect that Karl Marx saw the Industrial Revolution having on society in the 1800s. And specifically what he focused on was the development of class struggle as a result of all this industrialization. So he focused on social classes, which is simply the position a person occupies in society based on how much income or wealth they have and how they've obtained that. Now, social class is probably a term you're familiar with, and you have people in a lower social class, and in the middle, and in a higher social class. So I'm pointing out the obvious here, but each one of these is considered better or worse than the other. Another way of saying that is you have a social class hierarchy. If people were in different social classes and they were not better or worse than another, then they would just be in different social classes. But because different social classes are in a better or worse position, some are more desirable than others, this is referred to as a social class hierarchy. They are stratified. That's another general term for this, social stratification. And what Marx saw was that while the Industrial Revolution certainly caused societies as a whole to become easier, in many ways it made life easier to advance, it also created a lot of misery and poverty for the lower class. So for all of these mechanical advances that occurred, which are certainly positive advances for society overall, at the same time, the Industrial Revolution created class struggle. The struggle between these different social classes in this hierarchy. In other words, class struggle refers to the tension that exists between social classes because they each have their own interests. their own economic interests, and their own social interests. And just as a tip here, if you're going to write socioeconomic or socioeconomic status, just use the acronym SES and it'll be easier for you. So, according to Marx, those people he saw who were members of the lower working class, who would trudge out the door every day to factories to work 8 or 10 or 12-hour shifts, and then trudge home again during the Industrial Revolution to their small, run-down, pretty miserable, tiny apartments crammed in close together, they would have their own interests. The lower working class would be interested in things like having as high a wage as they could possibly get. They would be interested in having as much time off as they could possibly get. They would be interested in improving working conditions, that kind of thing. Likewise, the middle class would have their own interests. And then the upper class, which is the very well off, the people who were the owning class, who would live in houses with multiple bedrooms and a dining room and green space on their property and servants, they had their own interests and concerns. They would want to keep wages as low as possible to maximize profits. And they wouldn't want workers taking time off. And they wouldn't be concerned about working conditions. This idea of competing interests between the different social classes, this tension, both classes not only have their own interests, but these interests are opposed. It can become a really, really complicated concept, but at its most basic is a really fairly simple one. This is the basis of conflict theory, class conflict. Conflict theory focuses on all of the tension that underlies existing social structures caused by this conflict between the classes. So, I'm going to summarize conflict theory again in kind of everyday language. So what Karl Marx did was he looked at industrialization and he saw that it created a lot of poverty. It created a lot of economic inequality because there were all these really, really rich factory owners who were getting more rich and staying rich. And then you had the lower working class who were working, not getting ahead and staying in the lower class. And they both have their own things that they worry about, their own things that they want. And what they each want is kind of fundamentally opposed to what the other one wants. This is not a happy situation for the workers. But what Marx thought was that all of this tension, all of this class conflict would eventually reach the top, so to speak. So I want you to kind of picture a volcano rumbling and rumbling and rumbling and rumbling, and eventually the volcano explodes, it goes off. This is generally what Marx thought would happen in society, that eventually the lower working class would kind of rumble, and eventually they would have enough. They would rise up together, and this would lead to social change. Now, I want you to think about the size of each of these classes, okay? How many really, really wealthy factory owners would they be compared to how many workers would they be? Even though the owning class, the upper owning class, higher class are in control, even though they have the majority of the money, there's not many of them compared to how many workers are. There's lots and lots of workers, even though they are submissive. And what Marx believed would happen, again, keep picturing a volcano getting ready to blow, was that all of these lower class workers would eventually become aware of how exploited they were by the owners. And it's not that Marx thought that the lower working class were not intelligent or weren't aware of what was going on, that they were unaware of what their position was. It's that he didn't think that they were aware of just how exploited they were. And eventually they would realize it. And so what Marx thought would happen was that eventually the workers would kind of unite. This quote here, workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains, one of Marx's most famous quotes, because he thought that again, all this would build and build until some kind of revolution would occur, like a workers' revolution where the workers come together. And as a result of that, the owning class would be eliminated. And I don't mean they would all be killed off. I mean that he thought society would be restructured so that there would be no such thing as private property ownership and owners. And instead, social classes would be eliminated and everybody would be on the same level. Very, very optimistic expectation. In theory, a great one. In reality, not so much. We do have some countries in the world that are based on this system. China, Cuba, North Korea, Laos, Vietnam. Russia attempted it for a while. But for the most part, what Marx predicted would be great in theory, what he predicted would produce equality for everybody in theory, did not work as well in real life. It just didn't quite work out that way.